So the mission for this iteration of the cable vise is to come up with a shop-made tightening mechanism that doesn't require any kind of secondary lock to keep it in place and doesn't spin free under the tightening tension of the cables. So I reuse portions of the old version, but need to mill up some new runners. Cutting these at a slight angle for a reason I'll explain later. I want to try to make shop-made pulleys for the ends. Here's what happened when I don't eject the chips when drilling those holes. And there'll be 2 pulleys on the end of each of the runners. That does a couple things for me. It gives me some more mechanical advantage without the necessity of a double pulley, and it also distributes the tension on the cables more evenly. I use some hickory for the shop-made pulleys. This is my circle making jig for the disc sander. I get it to the point I want, use a clamp as a stop block so that I can make 4 identical pulleys. Drill the center just a little bit, enough to register on the lathe and cut a groove for the cables. I use a little bit of CA glue, the pen turner trick that I've seen, to try to strengthen and protect the ends, or the outside of the pulley, and then drill the inside hole the rest of the way. And I found some pipe with a perfect 1 inch or ½ inch diameter on the inside, so I glue that into the pulley, so that'll wear a bit better than the hickory will. And cut a shaft for those pulleys and glue and hammer it in place. They spin pretty freely. Now I need some springs on the end of the runners, so I drill some holes now. This will make sense later. Now I work on the front of the vise. It's going to be 3 parts. 2 are 2x stock, and then a piece of ½ inch plywood in the middle. Plywood middle has a cutout that I divide into 16 sections with an inner circle that lets me mark and drill 16 holes around the perimeter of that inner disc. This is what's going to give me the resistance that'll keep the hand crank in place. And I drilled those just so that the tip of the Forstner bit pokes through the back, so that I can mark out corresponding holes on the back of the vise front. And then I drill holes where each of those marks was. And each of these holes is going to receive a piece of steel rod. This probably isn't making sense yet why this is going to give me a resistance, or maybe you figured it out. But here's me installing all 16 of those metal rod sections. So now I cut the disc out of the middle plywood piece. The scroll saw lets me do that without any kind of cut through like I'd have with the bandsaw, and use the same circle making jig to take a little bit off the diameter of the outside so it'll spin freely. And I need it to be just a little bit thinner so that there's not too much friction between the front and the back of that vise. Each of these holes receives a rare earth magnet, but here comes a mistake. Whoops, should have had it flat against the bench, but it's easy to fix. I install all the magnets, and you've probably guessed the magnetic bond between those metal shafts is what's going to give the resistance that I need. Pour epoxy over the top, and then I clamp the broken section flat and just let it dry or cure level. Now I need to join this to the shaft, so I drill a hole parallel to the disc and then go through the center. Here's what I end up with. Now I can mark out, cut the shaft, and drill a hole corresponding on the shaft that I can then put a pin through to lock this all in place. And I'll need a hole for the cable, since this is where the cable will wind around, so I drill that now. Now I can work on the rest of the vise. I drill the hole that will allow the shaft to go through, and put another one of these from the pipe in that front piece of the vise. I glue that on with cold weld epoxy. I need a pulley in the front of the vise, and I'm not going to do any shop-made thing. I'll just take a pulley apart and use the steel. It's similar to what I did in the first video. Drill a shaft and a recess for the pulley. And chisel those edges straight, even though I lost a lot of that footage. Now I can put the shaft through the pulley and have it locked in place. That second metal shaft I just put in was a mistake drill. I measured wrong. And now there's some additional anchoring holes that I need to drill in the vise before I glue it all up. So I have a feeling I might have to take this apart a few times, so I don't want to glue it entirely together, so the front is just held on with the screws. Here's how it all comes together. Now to work on the coupling that will actually turn that metal shaft. I use a big block of Purple Heart. It's heavy, it's strong, but it's also annoying to work with. I take the corners off with the draw knife. I'll be turning this, and that just makes the turning go a lot faster, and I didn't really feel like angling the table saw blade. Now to get this parallel to the shaft, I use a scrap piece of 1/2 inch metal rod, and I just kind of fiddle with it until it's eyeball straight. You know, you could put a caliper on this, but that's not really necessary to have that level. Then I put chuck the piece of Purple Heart up there and turn it around. Now it should be parallel to the shaft, or parallel enough for this application. So I need another pin to join this to the shaft. Can't trust glue, it'll be too much torque. And another hole for the handle. This Purple Heart is really a pain in the butt to drill. And I drill out the corresponding hole in the shaft. And now it's a matter of putting it together. Oh, I need some hinges on the back of those runners. So the front of the vise needs to be able to move with respect to those runners. The first thing that happens, they get locked in place, and that hinge allows the vise still to have clamping pressure with the runners locked in place. It's only a couple of degrees of travel, but that's all it needs. I use screws to keep it in the unclamped position, and some construction legs just to hold it in place with those couple extra degrees that you can see there of travel on those hinges that allow for the clamping to happen. So now I anchor the cable in the shaft with some glue and a little nail, and thread all the cable through and anchor it where it needs to be anchored on the front of the vise. Put the handle on. And now it's together. So how did it all work out this time? Well, I'd say it's almost perfect. I'm getting very close to a workable design here. Let me show you how it's working. It's still quick release, of course, the whole concept, and the quick release still is deactivated by the same motion as the tightening, so there's no separate lever. You know, the option to use a pin and a disc to register and keep this in place, that would have worked, but I really wanted to come up with something that I didn't need to do that, hence the magnetic disc. But you've already watched all that, so why am I talking about it? Anyway, the vise is working. It is staying in place, but just barely. Let's see if I can get it to slip. I mean, it just feels like it's just on the verge of letting go on me. So just a little bit more resistance, I think, would have been a good thing. It's still very easy to actuate it. One problem that you may have noticed is that it takes about 3.5 turns to get really tight. 1, 2, 3, and a little bit more. That's kind of a lot. Not the end of the world, but it's a thing that if it could be solved, I think it would make this a better vise. And lastly, there's a little bit of an issue with where the cable meets the shaft. You see, when I tighten this, it's hard to get a good camera shot here, but when I tighten this, it's going to bend that cable at a 90-degree angle and a very sharp radius turn. And I think over time that cable might break and fail. You know, I really want to be turning and wrapping the cable around larger diameter surfaces, areas, whatever. And that sharp turn, I think, is going to cause me problems. So, 3 remaining issues. 1, a little bit more resistance on the shop-made shaft to keep it in place when it's tight. 2nd, fewer turns to get to tight. And 3rd, no sharp turn on the cable that would eventually lead to failing. I believe I have solutions that address all of these and ultimately make this even better tool, even though I think it's quite close right now. So I hope you enjoyed. I'll have at least, well, hopefully just one more iteration. I think I'm really close here. And then the question is, what then? You know, I'm planning on building another bench at some point, and I think that the cable vise is something that I'm going to use, provided the next iteration goes away. I think it will. But I'm also really curious to hear from the audience if this is something that you'd be interested in plans for. Developing plans to the point that I can sell them would be quite a learning curve for me. It'd be a lot of effort. And I'm kind of struggling. You know, I'd love to do it if I'm going to get some good sales and there's going to be a lot of interest, but it'd be a shame to put all that time in and then just not get many sales. So looking for some feedback there from you. I really think this is an interesting solution. There's no other vise, well, except for one that costs $400. That's a single action, quick release, tightening mechanism, activates and deactivates it. It's non-racking, and even that one doesn't open nearly as wide or have such little sag because of these long runners. So I'm really excited about this and curious to hear how excited all of you are as well. Anyway, enough rambling. That's all for today, and wish me luck on the final version. Thanks.